Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says he is staying on as Liberal leader. This less than 24 hours after some of his own Liberal MPs asked him to step aside.
We're going to continue to have great conversations about what is the best way to take on Pierre Poilievre in the next election, but that'll happen with me as leader going into the next election.
That answer has left some of the dissenting Liberal MPs dissatisfied, while others say they hope the Prime Minister still has some reflecting left to do.
I don't think that he felt that he needed to reflect at all. I think his mind was made up.
What do you make of that?
Disappointing. I wouldn't call it delusional, but he's seeing something that I don't see, that my constituents don't see.
I'm not surprised that the Prime Minister said that. I mean, if he would have said anything else, you probably would be a lame duck Prime Minister.
We deserved a sit down, a good back and forth on Monday. That's, I think, what everybody expected, and we didn't get that. So, I heard about it when I was sitting in committee. I was like, no, he couldn't have come back that quick, but he did.
I think it's understandable under those circumstances that he would answer that way. But I'm confident that he'll take the time to think about what he heard from colleagues.
Okay, we have lots to talk about with the Power Panel today. Cameron Ahmad is a former head of communications to Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. James Moore is a former Conservative cabinet minister. Shachi Curl, is the president of the Angus Reid Institute. True, but it's been a long week, Shachi. Trust me, it was a slip. And here with me in studio, Andrew Thompson is a former Saskatchewan NDP cabinet minister. It's good to see you all. Those four MPs we heard from just before we started all spoke against the Prime Minister staying in caucus yesterday. Patrick Weiler was, in fact, the first person to speak and the person who read the letter aloud and confirmed its existence. Cameron, less than 24 hours after he said he'd think about it, he thought about it and he said, I'm staying. How do you think that affects the dynamic in the caucus right now?
Well, the first thing I'm happy to see is that it looks like the Liberal team, including those who are generally unhappy or frustrated with him, his leadership, seem to have maintained a degree of respect and are able to air their frustrations without the whole thing descending into complete bitterness, which has certainly happened before in Liberal Party internal dynamics. But it's also clear the Prime Minister doesn't want to go anywhere, and I think he probably laid out a pretty strong case as he sees it, and as many of his supporters see it. I mean, let's remember that 20 plus MPs may have signed a letter asking for him to resign or consider resigning, but many more did not, and many more have been vocally and actively supporting him staying on because they think he's the best bet to take the party into the next election. So now what, right? I think the party and everyone involved needs to bring the focus back to what really matters for them, which is focus on building towards the next campaign, build up your contrast messaging, build out your plan, and figure out how you're going to prove to Canadians that there's a reason to vote for something, vote for them, the vision for the future, and the alternative in the Conservative Party and all the dangers and undoing of the progress that they've all had a hand in that would bring.
So, James, on that, 24 are confirmed to have signed the letter, though the names were not shared with the Prime Minister. It is 24, and somewhere between 20 and 30 spoke largely in favor of change in the caucus meeting yesterday. So it's not a majority, but it's not 5 or 6. And the Prime Minister seems unswayed by it. What do you think happens now? Do you think this is over with his decision today?
Absolutely not. And you have to imagine that the number of people who are really anxious about it is probably times 2, maybe times 3, right? Those are just the people who are prepared to actually put their names forward or at least stand up in the relative discretion of a caucus room and make their observations felt. It's one thing for the Prime Minister to say, I've heard you and I'm listening to you and I'm going to reflect. And then within 24 hours to come out and say, I've reflected, I'm good, we're staying on. When people in your backbench have come to you in a pretty respectful way with a pretty thoughtful letter and said, you've been a great Prime Minister, we support you, you're our friend, and we've done a lot of good things together, but we want you to reflect and we think it's time for you to go forward. And you don't just disagree, but frankly, you show disrespect to the courtesy that they've tried to show you of a diplomatic way to exit. And whether one can agree or disagree with the approach that they've taken. But I think that those backbenchers who have tried, I think, to sort of soft pedal and ease the Prime Minister into a mindset that would see him leave, and then within 24 hours he just says, no, I'm staying. I think people are going to start getting a little bit more aggressive in their tone and their language and their expectations that the Prime Minister just flat out go. So I think the Prime Minister has triggered probably a much more aggressive tone in response to what we've seen so far.
Andrew, how do you see it? Because I was surprised to see it so quickly. I'm not surprised he arrived at this point, because I think that was the most likely outcome going into all of this. But to have it done so quickly, and to have it done at a press conference and not like to his caucus directly saying, I've thought about it and here's where I am, though he did leave them with the impression he was staying. What do you make of this?
Well, this seems to be very much the way he's operated with his caucus. I mean, the caucus has said all along that they never really feel drawn into it. I guess that in some ways, it's palace intrigue. We love palace intrigue, especially on these kind of shows.
On these shows, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it keeps us in business, right? But, in terms of the ordinary voters, I think that they momentarily poke their heads up and they listen and they think, is something changing or not? And in this case, the Prime Minister said, no, nothing's changing. Everything's fine. Thank you very much. And I think voters will drift back to exactly the ballot question that they've already got in their mind, which is, do we want 4 more years of this government and this Prime Minister or not? That's the danger, I think, for the Liberals, is that they've, lost an opportunity to change the channel. Doesn't mean they don't have others. Cameron certainly said there's lots of other stuff they can do. I don't know what that is, but, this is their opportunity now over the next several months to point that out.
So, Shachi, right after they all came out of caucus and said on camera, we're not going to tell you what happened in caucus, a lot of them picked up their phones and called us to tell us what happened in caucus. And one of the telling lines that was said to one of my colleagues was that they believe the Prime Minister and his supporters are putting wishful thinking ahead of data, in terms of they think they can turn this around in a year and he's the right guy to do it, because the polls have been pretty rough and the by-elections, actual numbers, have been rougher. But what are your thoughts on where this leaves things?
Well, data can tell 2 stories, David, and in this case, data is telling 2 stories. You're right, the polls have been rough. They have been consistently rough for the better part of 2 years, and so far nothing seems to be changing that. However, the other set of data shows that any of the other pretenders to the throne or would-be replacements are not exactly going to set the House on fire. At best, at the top of the list, you've got maybe a Chrystia Freeland or a Mark Carney, who, yes, they galvanize the existing Liberal base, and let's remember that the existing Liberal base has really shrunk. Maybe they sway a few people who have drifted away from the Liberal Party over to the Conservatives over the last couple of years. But it's not enough to rebuild the size of the Liberal tent the way it looked even as far back as 2021. And that is the problem. And I think that's something that the Prime Minister's also, taking into account. But I also agree a lot with what Andrew said, which is, this is just quintessentially Justin Trudeau. He's not going to do anything he doesn't want to do. We have seen that same diffidence and doubling down and tripling down over the years. Why would anyone have thought that this particular instance would be different, or that he hasn't already been thinking about this for the better part of weeks and weeks as this palace intrigue has dragged on? So there's that factor, and there's also the fact that, hey, you know what? Breakups take more than one attempt before they stick. And in this case, I think we are going to see, more instances of people speaking out, of grumbling, of saying they want something different, something changed within caucus. But ultimately, are they planning to leave the Liberal caucus? Are they going to step out and sit as independents and leave the party? That is really the next piece of the end game, which, the end feels like a very long time away. But, those are the next pieces.
No, there has been no or else, right? Go or else. Like, it's not Chuck Strahl and Deb Gray doing what they did to Stockwell Day. It's a very different kind of dynamic. But Cameron, Shachi talked about the challenges of rebuilding sort of the Liberal coalition back to even 2021. The Liberals I've spoken to, and you know more than I do, I don't think they're looking at that. I think they're like, we need to do this to save the furniture, because there's a realistic possibility we slip behind at least the Bloc Québécois, is what they say, and who knows what happens there. That it's about having a high enough base after an anticipated tough election ahead to come back from quickly, or maybe hold Mr. Poilievre to a minority as opposed to the mountain of seats it looks like he may get if the polls don't change. What's your sense of what the ambition is here for the people who are pushing for change inside your party?
I think there's just a lot of anxiety that they're feeling right now, and it's in part channeling the anxiety that their constituents feel about the state of the economy, the state of the country, and laying the blame at the leadership of their party and of the government. And as Minister Miller said just before we came on, they've got a right to feel the way they do. The Liberal Party is a team that encourages internal debate, And some his supporters, and he himself, I'm sure, wanted them to say it to his face. I think two quick things. One, he does have to show some strength when his leadership is being challenged, and I think he managed to do that today in as respectful a way as possible. And two, of course, he's been thinking about this for a while. This is not the first time that people have questioned his leadership or have challenged his position and asked him to reconsider, or told him that it's time he should go. To answer your question, I think the hill to climb for the party is a steep one. No one's denying that. And certainly the Prime Minister is facing an enormous challenge right now as leader. But I think he does tend to perform, as we've talked about before, he does tend to perform at his best when he's under serious pressure. It's why he was able to perform so well under major crises like COVID and the Trump White House. And as a party right now, again, the most important thing that they can do to actually address the challenge that the Conservatives are putting up is to actually focus on that and to try and build a positive vision and message for the country to buy into. When you talk entirely about palace intrigue, when the internal dissent and disagreement starts to spill over into the public space, you lose all ability to talk about those other things, because that's the only thing that people focus on and care about.
So James, you suggested that you think the response could heighten the intransigence, I guess, inside caucus with some of the people inside the party who would like to see change. I noticed that David Hurley was very much in demand for commentary yesterday, going back to his experience with Paul Martin. But like, what do you think a next step could be here? Because it seems like this was the push, right? I don't know if there is a next act here. It's not like the Reform Act applies like it does in your party, but where they were able to make change with Aaron O'Toole very quickly because of the system. What do you think might happen?
I imagine it'll be inelegant, and it'll be one-off members of Parliament, one by one, randomly, maybe on social media, on a podcast, maybe on your show, coming out and saying, I've had enough. We try to, and the language will get amped up and dialed up and more frustrated. You know, Justin Trudeau, he is the leader of the Liberal Party, but he's also the Prime Minister of the country. As leader of the Liberal Party, he's got a real problem. As Prime Minister of the country, he's got a real problem, but not until whenever the election is called. And he is the leader of a G7 country. He has to sort of project strengths to the best that he can to let Canadians know that they do have a Prime Minister who's on the job and trying to do his job. And so therefore he has to say, you know, I'm not resigning, I'm staying firm and all that. But remember, 2 days before Joe Biden stepped down as candidate for the Democratic Party, he held a rally and saying he'll never step down. The day before Richard Nixon resigned as president, he said he would never resign. So, you know, Justin Trudeau has to show strength until maybe he is confronted with sobriety of the reality of the circumstance in front of him. But what happens next? It's probably going to be inelegant, and it's going to be people, it'll be riding association presidents, former candidates, we've got Eddie Goldenberg out there saying what he's saying. And it's going to continue to get ugly. You know, for his own sake, I would think the Prime Minister would try to find what's left of a dignified exit for himself. But it seems to me that that's probably going to be impossible. You don't just get to stay on just because you assert it. And as Canadians see disorder in the Liberal Party, they're going to convert that to saying there's disorder in the government of Canada, in my government. This isn't a Liberal problem. This is now a Canadian problem, and I don't like it. And you're going to see the poll numbers tank further.
You know, and Andrew, they have the extra challenge that there's already a couple of dozen, maybe 3 dozen MPs who are not running again. And incumbency does matter. And if you get a couple of dozen more, which could be the outcome here, though people like Sean Casey say they're sticking around, that becomes an extra challenge for you in recruiting people, getting them staffed up, getting them financed for an election campaign that could come really at any time.
Yeah, sure. I mean, for candidate recruitment, this is terrible.
Fundraising, too.
Fundraising. I mean, they're already in trouble on fundraising. There's nothing really here that points to them breathing life in. This decision does anything to change the trajectory they're on. And I think that's really what what the question is. Now, the Prime Minister may well be in the mindset, and he would never say it, but that he feels that he wants to defend the record and that he should take the loss, giving a clean slate to a new leader after. I've certainly heard this from other leaders, put forward this argument before. But I think what they forget is that this is also possibly a scenario like we saw with Mulroney and the Kim Campbell situation. I mean, it's not impossible where, even if they did change the leader, that the opinion is so hard set against that party and what that government has done that they could just remove them from office anyway. So, I mean, the Prime Minister is looking there and he goes, is it better to stay? Is it better to go? Is it in my interest? Is it in the country's interest? Ultimately, what seems to be missing is what's in the party's interest. And, for Canadians, I don't know that they care that much about the Liberal Party. They care about the quality of the government. They're interested in kind of who's running the place, but the intrigue internally, I don't think they're too concerned about.
So Shachi, just a quick question on that, because I got to take a break. But this is Andrew just alluded to something that Sean Casey mentioned last week when he came on the show. I think it was last week, might have been the week before, and said he thinks the Prime Minister should go. He said it has the potential to raise the ceiling, but the risk is it also lowers the floor. So he has anxiety about whichever way they go. What's your sense of the numbers? Like, does it change risk the bottom dropping out even further than it has over the past year or so?
It comes back, David, then to the appetite for change, which we've talked about just in the last few minutes, and how Canadians, beyond whatever their personal feelings for Justin Trudeau as Prime Minister, and how much they approve of him or don't, it's that they're now ready and indicating that they would like a different government with a different leader. And so that doesn't change with a new leader. I know, okay, scream at me, lots of people say that's true, but I can hear the talking points and the campaign points now. You know, what's different, running on the same record, still standing for the same thing, new face, same old story, blah, blah, blah. So it will be hard even for a new leader to turn around something that's been there for 9 years. It's a long time and a long record to defend, and that's the part that we haven't talked about.
Okay, we've got to leave it there. Go ahead, Cameron, quick.
Just really quick. I mean, this may be surprising to many, but I think that the Liberal Party's fundraising is actually doing surprisingly pretty well. I think they broke a new record this fall. So everything, I agree, Andrew is making good points, but there is still quite a strong grassroots base to the party that believes in its abilities to keep fighting.
Well, that may be true, but that grassroots and the caucus would like some of that money to be spent on ads that they've been promised for a year, and they're not showing up. So, the point of having the money is to use it, and we'll see if they start doing that. Okay.